Now, we're going to begin with a passage out of 1 Peter, but I'm going to begin with a story, if you guys don't mind, that was told to me this week by a client of mine, a good man that has been growing in his Christian faith. He has not always been a strong believer. He's getting stronger every day. But he told me about an incident that happened to him years ago when he just started going to church with his wife. She started to invite him in. And he tells me a story. He said, man, Pete, I was a young guy. I was a very hot-headed gentleman. I was just, young people full of testosterone, guys the way they are. And he said, I'm driving down the interstate one day, and this guy just cuts me off. And he said, I couldn't take that. So he passes the guy and cuts him off. And so now there's this whole road rage incident where they're driving around aggressively. They're cutting each other off, throwing the bird at each other. It's just not pleasant. So he finally takes an exit. The guy takes an exit behind him. This guy says, man, I couldn't take it anymore. So I pulled up alongside of him. I flagged him down. They both pull over. The guy runs out, opens the car door, reaches in, just grabs the guy by his lapels, and he's about to choke him out when all of a sudden he recognizes the guy from church. Awkward. He said, I, for a moment, just paused, and I slowly let him go, and he said, you are lucky. I know you. You're lucky you go to my church, and just went back in his car and drove away. I don't know what happened after that. I mean, that makes for some awkward church conversation when you see him in the lobby. But isn't that something that happens every day in this society, in the Christian community in America, where we come to church and we seem just so holy, so in the Word here, right? Everybody's looking so great. You've got your family, you've got your tie on, you look so good. And then you go home, you arrive at home 2 hours later, and just life kind of seeps back in, and we're back right where we started off. And the same words, the same deeds, actions, thoughts, the same pattern of lifestyle comes back in, and we're right back where we were. I'm going to read today from 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance. But alike the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior, because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. You shall be holy, for I am holy. That's the name of our series. We don't have our background yet for this service, but the name of the series we're beginning right now, it's called Becoming a Mature Believer. How do we grow in our knowledge of Christ? How do we become mature believers? Because today, many preachers will tell you this today. This is a fact. The Christianity in America is some of the most immature Christianity in the world. It's very weak, it's very soft, and it's up to us, folks, to change that. This is the church that has to change that from inside. We know today, here in the culture that we live in, holiness is not preached very often. That's the topic of today's sermon, holiness. Holiness is not preached very often, even though it's mentioned almost 900 times in the Bible. God continues to say, holy, 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 but I quote Pastor James McDonald. He says, somehow, we've lost the concept of holiness in the church. The biblical teachings on holiness were once central to the message of Christian living, yet we've stopped talking about it. We love to talk about justification and grace. We love to talk about the fact that we're saved through Jesus Christ, through his blood. We love that stuff, right? We love to talk about knowledge and gaining more of a knowledge of Jesus. We love to talk about spiritual experiences that we've had. But sanctification, or the process of becoming holy, is very difficult to talk on because it means painful processes inside of us. It means we have to cut away things inside of us. We have to remove things inside of us. And that is why sanctification is such a sign of a mature believer today. Because mature believers, when we see somebody who's maybe older in their age or mature in their belief, they don't want to do a lot of things that we want to do. I have a grandma and a grandpa. They're both in their late 70s, early 80s. I can promise you that taking just a bike down the interstate at 80 miles an hour is not on their bucket list, right? They have a scooter. They're fine with that, but they're not going to drive around a Harley. They're over that, It's something they've matured past. They don't need that anymore. And so you see the same thing with mature believers where at some point they're saying, man, I don't need some of these childish things. I'm going to put them away in order to become more holy in my life. And that is exactly what the word holiness means. It means to cut, to separate, to leave behind. Fundamentally, holiness is cutting off or separation from what is unclean and consecration to what is pure. And this doesn't mean that we leave the world, right? What I'm not trying to say here is holiness is I'm going to leave the world. I'm going to leave society in general. I'm going to move to a different country, like the Pilgrims did to America, moving away from Europe. That's not what God says. He says you're going to stay in the society that you're in. But your heart is going to cut ties with, as Peter said, with the former lusts which were in your ignorance. You're going to have to cut some ties in your heart. It's easy to become a monk and move away and live in a monastery. You're going to have to make some cuts inside of your heart, and you're going to have to make them today. Bud Robinson, a well-known preacher, was taken by his friends to see New York, and they walked him around. It's a beautiful, beautiful city, and they showed him everything and all these cool shops and Central Park and all the skyscrapers. And he went back home that night, and he said, I prayed a prayer, and I said, Lord, thank you so much for letting me see all the sights of New York. And they said, God, I thank you even more that I didn't see a single thing that my heart desired. And I think, man, when I walk down the street, my heart desires everything around me. I want to see it all. I want to grab it all. And he says, no. I'm not attached to anything anymore. I have cut myself away, and I see it, but it doesn't attract me. Now, one thing I want to establish right at the get-go before we jump into the main point here is holiness. This is going to be an equation, so you guys can write it down in math form. Holiness minus God, that should say equals hypocrisy. Holiness without God equals hypocrisy. Our rebellious heart, and we all agree that our heart is very rebellious. We would love to be good without God. We would love to be good without God. But that leads to hypocrisy. And Jesus said to some of the people in his time who tried to do that, they tried to be good without necessarily involving God. He said, listen, then he said to them, you like to appear righteous in public, but God knows your heart. What this world honors is detestable in the sight of God. God says, if you try to do good without me, if you try to appear holy without me in your heart, it's detestable. He doesn't just, that's, not professional. That's not the best thing to do. He says, no, I hate it. I abhor when you try to do good things without me. Because in essence, what it is plagiarism. God is the source of all good. If I came here today and I began to quote Hemingway or, some Russian writer, some Pushkins, right? And I began to quote these words that were so beautiful, this poem, and then I was like, yeah, I wrote it last night. And you guys be like, whatever. We know you, Pete. You can barely quote Wikipedia. You get out of there. So that's plagiarism, right? Everybody who's in college knows what I'm talking about. If we try to do good without God, if we try to take the credit, if we say, yeah, I've become holy, that's plagiarism. And God says, I abhor it. I hate it. I detest it. And so let's jump into our main points. And we're actually going to follow a story of the prophet Isaiah as we walk through some of these main points. In order to be holy, that's the question we're going to answer today. How do we become holy? In order to be holy, first of all, we must see God's perfection. We must see God's perfection. And we're going to open to Isaiah chapter 6, but we're not going to read from there. Just kind of keep your finger there. We actually had a terrific sermon. Brother Ben preached on this passage just a couple of Sundays ago at our youth service. So I'm not going to go to try to break this passage down, but we're going to look at God for a second. Because to be holy, we must see God's perfection. That's point number one. Now, some of you guys imagine God very similarly to what you saw, in grade school. in Sunday school. Maybe you see the old man in the clouds, but maybe you see Jesus, right, with the lamb and the long hair and the nicely trimmed beards and just the kind eyes. And you think, well, that's God. That's who God is. He's just this kind, wouldn't hurt a fly kind of a guy in his long robe. Or can we, for a second, fathom a God that we see in the book of Isaiah? Isaiah chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet. With 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. We're going to pause there for a second. Man, that imagery of God. Think about this. What Isaiah saw was a being that was just divine perfection. Everything was right. This is the very definition of holiness. Because let's think about this. If you are completely holy, if you are completely perfect, a holy creature does not sin, right? And sin leads to death, but with no sin, you would not die. A holy being would not die. A holy being would be perfect in its love. A holy being would be perfect in its strength, in its knowledge. It would be perfect in every single way. In fact, ultimately, a divine, perfect being would not be constrained to this world, to any space-time dimensions. It is 100% pure, perfect in every single way. And that is what he saw. And the crazy part is that is so unique to our God, the God of the Bible, because if you look back through the ages and the times, you see the gods of the Romans and the Greeks and the pantheons of all these gods that they had out there. You'll see them squabbling and fighting amongst themselves, and there's human jealousy, and there's so much imperfection there, so much unholiness and sin amongst all the made-up gods that are out there. So our God stands over and above all that. That's what makes him unique, and that's why this is so true, because he stands above all of that. He is holy. And we see it repeated again and again. The seraphim, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. If you can imagine for a second a God that we see before Moses, a perfect God standing and speaking to Moses and saying, hey, you can't come to the mountain yet. Go tell the people they should not even come near because I am so holy. My mere presence, a mere manifestation of my being has made miles and miles of land holy. If people come and touch the mountain, they will be put to death. I've made this whole area, that's how holy I am. If you can imagine the holy God in the temple or in the tabernacle where he says, folks, you guys can come into the outer courtyard, the priests can come into the temple area, but nobody dare enter the Holy of Holies. Once a year, a priest will come in for a couple of minutes, and all of the people of Israel will stand outside and pray for the guy's safety. That's the only time you can come in. He said, you can't stand before me. I am so holy. If I walked amongst you, the amount of death would be inconceivable. This whole people would be wiped out. I am perfect. And your sinful flesh can't handle that. You can't stand being the sight of a perfect God, just as you can't, we can't stand the sun. Folks, some of us will walk outside for 15 minutes and we'll get burned. Can you imagine standing in the power and the presence of something that created the sun and millions of other suns? Your sinful flesh just can't handle that, he said. You can't. We read in the book of Hebrews, strive for holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. And so to be holy, we must see God's perfection. To be holy, we must see our peccability, our imperfection. Isaiah, we read here, we'll pick up where we left off, verse 5. And I said, woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King and the Lord of hosts. Folks, I love this passage because we see in the book of Isaiah that Isaiah serves almost like God's prosecuting attorney. He'll walk amongst the people, he'll write messages, and he'll say, God is judging you, you are guilty, guilty, guilty. And then all of a sudden, this prosecuting attorney turns here into the defendant and says, Father, I've seen you, I know who you are, and now I see I am guilty. I'm no longer pointing the finger out there. I am guilty. To be holy, we must see our peccability. He says, woe is me. I don't think anybody here is going to deny that you're not perfect. I think maybe some of your parents have told you that. Maybe wives, you've heard that from your husbands. Oh, you're so perfect. We're not perfect in love, in knowledge, in strength, in power. We're not perfect in any way. We're not going to deny that. We understand that we're peccable, which is the opposite of impeccable. And so we talked about to be holy, you must see God's perfection. You must see our peccability. And the third P in this structure, to be holy, we must experience God's process of purification. Process of purification, which is called sanctification. We go back to Isaiah verse 8, and I heard the voice of the Lord. Verse 6, then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. God's process of purification. Isaiah had his lips touched with an angel with a coal from the altar. In the same sense, Paul writes to the Ephesians, he says, put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Folks, the process of purification boils down to this. It's a process in our life as we strive and we become more and more like God. Because he is holy, and to be that way, we become more and more like him. We become more like God, more like Jesus. We begin to be less imperfect. We cut things from our life. And so there's a process to that. We have steps of sanctification, and we'll go through really quickly here. This is how we become sanctified. This is how we become holy. And the first step in the steps of sanctification is to identify. We read, and this is a passage everybody knows, identify. You can be like David, and he writes, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. I love the courage that David has here. I mean, I can walk up to a TSA agent and I can say, search me, right? And the guy will pat me down, and it'll be really uncomfortable, and I'll walk out. You can walk into a doctor's office and you can say, hey, search me. And the doctor, he'll be a little bit more thorough. He'll put you through an x-ray machine, a CAT scan. He'll make you drink some funny things, but he's going to really look for things inside of you. And then you walk before God and you say, search me. And God says, are you sure? Because I will find things. Oh, I will find many things. And David said, no, God, I'm sure. I'm so positive. I desire to be like you so much. Search me, God. Let not an ounce of cancer remain inside of me. Put me through your most powerful x-ray machine. Put me through whatever trials you have to put me through. But I need to know what's inside. I need to know what's going on inside of me. I need to identify the sin that is in me. I can't keep doing what I've been doing. I can't be the same person today that I was yesterday. I need to keep identifying what is happening inside of me. And so the question today is, what is keeping you from God today? Because at its very essence, that's what sin is. Sin is anything that keeps you from God. What is keeping you from God today? It may be something very large, something you've been struggling with for years. Folks, if you're the same today at 45 that you were at 15, there's an issue there. If that same sin has been plaguing you all of your life, you can identify it today. Or maybe it's something minor. Maybe it's something that you think, well, that's not a big deal. But remember, folks, anything that keeps you from God. At age 19, Dr. James Clement Furman, who became the first president of Furman University, he wrote some of these resolutions, and one of which I love. He says, resolved to leave as soon as possible any company which might draw off my thoughts from the things of eternity. I'll repeat that. Resolve to leave as soon as possible any company which might draw off my thoughts from the things of eternity. What draws off your thoughts from the things of eternity? What occupies your thoughts, your mind, on a daily basis that keeps you from thinking about God, from being with God, from fellowshipping with God every second of your life? It may be, folks, it may be just social media, games. We talked about your Netflix account. Maybe that's what's happening. Maybe it's that second shift that you're working, the third shift that you're picking up. Maybe it's the friendships in your life, the company that you keep. Ephesians 5:11, Paul writes, do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness. Man, sometimes the deeds of darkness, they're not the most evil thing out there. They're just unfruitful. They're just something that's not bringing the fruit of holiness in your life. And so you first identify, and then comes the painful part. You cut. You cut. Jenny Lind, a famous opera singer back in the late 1800s, left everything at the height of her career and retired. People were amused, people were shocked, they were curious, and one of her friends sought her out. She was sitting on a beach reading her Bible, and they had a conversation, and her friend finally asked and says, Jenny, I don't get it. I don't get it. Why did you leave your career, all the fame and money, everything that was out there? You had the world in the palm of your hand. Why did you leave all that? I mean, that doesn't happen to everybody. And her quiet response was, when every day it made me think less of this, she said as she pointed to the Bible, and less of that, she said, pointing to the sunset. What else could I do? When every day something in my life makes me think less of God, of His creation, of His people, of the church. What else could I do? She said, but leave that. There's another great example that happened recently. I don't know if anybody here is a football fan, but Patrick Willis, who was a linebacker here for the San Francisco 49ers, he leaves everything at the prime of his career for what journalists call a religious awakening. The guy was due to make millions of dollars next season. One of the best players, they think he would have been a Hall of Fame player had he played for maybe 5 more years. And he said, no. I'm leaving everything behind. And he writes in a post online, he says, I have a higher purpose. I have a higher purpose than this. He's out working with inner city kids. He's out working in Tennessee with kids, with churches. He says, there's something greater than what I'm doing right now. It's not about the money, the fame that I've got right now. It's not about getting to the Hall of Fame for people to recognize me for years and ages to come. He said, I've got a higher purpose. This is distracting me from what I should be doing. How much do you want holiness? How much do you want purity? How much do you want perfection in your life? Jesus said, hey, if something's stopping you, you cut off your limb. You take out an eyeball, because better it is to go to heaven missing an arm, a leg, an eye, than it is to be destroyed. But you're whole. How much do you want holiness today? What's keeping your mind of Christ? Can we throw it out? Is there a relationship we need to cut today and we just need to say, listen, this relationship's not bringing me closer? This Netflix account, this TV subscription, this internet subscription, this phone subscription, this company that I keep, this event that I have to go with, these hours that I work, these people that are speaking into my life, this is not the right thing for me to do. Jesus says, cut it. Hate sin. Hate whatever keeps you from God. Because, folks, there's no such thing as half holiness. You can't be just half good, because holiness is perfect. If there's a single blemish, it's not holiness. And so we need to stand up. This church, not literally, but this church needs to stand and be a fighting church. We can't be a sitting church that's relaxed with where we're at. We need to fight and battle the sin in our lives, and from there we can grow. The next step of sanctification is grow. And growth happens from reading. Growth happens from finding out more about God's nature. Hugh Martin, in Parables of the Gospel, tells a story about a simple man, a rough coal worker who would come home every night, passes by this shop, and then one day he saw this beautiful vase in the shop, and he said, that's a pretty looking vase, it'll look great in my house. So he buys the vase, brings it in, sets it up on his mantle. As he steps back to kind of check it out, he notices, my wall's dirty behind. I mean, I've been living in this whole house for so long, I haven't noticed the wall's dirty. So he goes out, buys some paint, repaints the wall, and he realizes, shoot, my other walls need to be repainted too. So he repaints the room until he notices and says, now the carpet's dirty. I've been coming in here in my work boots. I didn't realize how dirty it was all these years. He replaces the carpet and says, well, my house is so beautiful now, I might as well get new furniture because it's so beat up. It's covered in coal soot from all these years of working. So he gets new furniture, and finally he says, listen, I'm the only dirty thing left in this house. I got to go take a shower and get some better clothes. And all started with a simple vase being brought in. Folks, that's what growth is about. Can you imagine if he just kept things the way they were? Just, hey, I've got a beautiful clean vase and everything else is going to be dirty. Pretty soon the vase is dirty as well. God says, listen, this is your light. This will shine into your life and point out things there that you haven't seen before. The question is, will you act on it? Francis Chan talks about how in his seminary they were taught one very important principle. He says the worst thing you can do to yourself when you read the Bible is say, got it, I'll do it tomorrow. That's the worst thing you can do. Because then we get into a habit. You read the Bible and you think, all right, I'm going to do this tomorrow. And that's a great point that Paul makes here. I'll do that tomorrow as well. And oh my goodness, Isaiah, all these experiences, that's incredible. Well, I'll look at that later on. And we just kind of put off Christianity to another day, put off our growth to another day. And Francis said, that's not the way we were taught to study the Bible. Our professor said, what you need to do is when you read Scripture, you implement it right there and then. When it says go feed the poor, you walk out of your room and you go feed the poor. When it says that you need to cut something off, you go and you cut that out of your heart right now. You begin that process right away. And that's how we begin to grow. Folks, you know and I know, we all know that there are Christians in this room, there are Christians all around the world. Their spiritual state today is exactly the same, if not worse, as it was when they came to Jesus 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 40 years ago. If you know nothing more about Jesus today than you did 20 years ago, shame. Because we're not growing. We're not feeding ourselves. We're not identifying anything inside of us. We're not cutting anything away. We're living a lifestyle that is completely immature. And we're talking about becoming mature believers. And as a cancer patient, I'm sure you all know somebody who suffered through that dreadful disease. And I speak to myself, first of all, here tonight, folks, or today. A cancer patient, once they're cleared of cancer, they don't just go home and say, well, that's it. If you know, somebody that's had cancer, I believe they go back in the next month for a checkup, and then the next month after that, and then eventually they have 3 months between their checkups, and eventually they have 6 months, and eventually they have a year, and finally they're said, okay, you're clear now. Years and years down the road, the checkups say that it's not coming back. Are we doing that to ourselves? Are we identifying? Are we cutting? Are we growing? And are we saying, yeah, I don't think I have an anger issue anymore. I'm going back. And after years and years and years, I think we've got that in check. Let me work on my pride. Let me work on my impatience. Let me work on the gossip. Let me work on whatever else is going on inside of my life. We keep growing and growing and growing so that when I meet you 5 years down the road, you say, Pete Kachuk has grown. He's a different man from when I knew him 5 years ago. Not just fatter, but spiritually. Do we grow? Do we advance? Do we become mature Christians? And finally, the last point, steps of sanctification: identify, cut, grow, and trust Christ. Because we don't have the strength to fight these battles ourselves. Let's be honest here. You think, Pete, that's such a great message. I'm going to cut all these things, and then tomorrow we're back in the same deal that we're in before. Those are some tough, tough battles to fight. And Jesus said, I am right there with you. You're not going to come to heaven perfect. You're going to come as messed up people, scarred from the battles with sin that you fought. But he writes, Paul writes, 1 Thessalonians 5:23, now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely. And may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. He who calls you is faithful, and he will surely do it. You can strive for perfection all your life. That is God's will for you. That's God's will for me. He said, you must be holy as I am holy. That's not a request. That is his will for our life. But he said at the same time, I'm going to sanctify you. There's no way you're getting there without the blood of my son, Jesus Christ, who I sent, and he died here 2,000 years ago to wash us all with his blood. And the happy news in all of this is it removes the fear inside of us. Folks, if before we were like Isaiah, that we would just bow before God and say, woe is me, I'm a sinful man. God said, I have removed that fear. There's a story about a wagon train that was making its way out to California. When somewhere in the Midwest, they saw a fire in the distance, something sparked in that dry heat that's out in those Midwestern states, and there was a raging prairie fire coming right at them. There was nowhere to go. There was just prairie behind, prairie to all sides. They couldn't run away. But one of the men had an idea, and he lit a fire right by where their wagons were. The fire slowly grew, but it happened to burn out a whole patch of ground that they quickly put all their oxen and horses and kids and families, all the wagons. They just put this whole group in this patch of ground that had already been burnt out. Because when the fire came their way, it would no longer burn the place that had been burned already. The fires of God's judgment burnt themselves out on Jesus, and all who are in Christ are safe forever. Folks, we're standing now where the fire used to be. We read 1 Corinthians 11:31, for if we judged ourselves truly, we could not be judged. I can assure you, and I believe this with all my heart, and you should too, that there is a judgment coming. There is a prairie fire. We see it in the distance now, closer than ever. A roaring fire of God's judgment, and he said, I will judge every single work. You bring it up to me, and the truth will come out. The beautiful home that you've built in your life, that beautiful family, kids, that beautiful job that you have, I will test it all in the fire. And the truth will come out. I'll end with just a quick story from Charles Spurgeon. You guys know him as a great, great preacher. And he was blackmailed once. He receives a letter that said, Charles, unless you begin to preach differently and stop, blaming, speaking on sin and other things, we will disclose everything about you. We're going to dig up all the dirty stuff about you. And Charles, the next day, takes that letter right up to the pulpit, and he reads it out loud, and he said, folks, I challenge you, and I call you, and I say, go for it. I hope that you take out the biggest billboard in London and put everything you know about me up on that billboard. I challenge you to do that. And it reminds me of Job when he said to God, God, I am righteous. Weigh me on your scales. Isn't that a conversation? Isn't that a challenge that we as believers should be able to make? Because I know if some of you said that today, if I said, I challenge you to go dig up something dirty on me, I'm sure you'll find something. But God said, I've removed that fear out of you. That fire is burned already. That judgment's passed. And before God, you are innocent. And so, identify, cut, grow, and trust Christ. Folks, can I call you all to prayer today? Can we all stand for prayer? I'll ask the band to come up as well, please. We'll pray and we'll begin our response time. During the worship, you guys can either pray in your seats as you just commune with God. You can sing, but let's just bow our heads right now. Father, it's so, so good to enjoy your presence today. It's good to know that you are merciful to us, that your judgment's been completely poured out on your Son. God, there's nothing left for us anymore if we judge ourselves. Holiness is such a difficult topic to talk on for me, God, because that is something we all strive for and something we fail miserably at every single day of our lives. But God, you offer that hope that if we come to you, whether that be today, in our hearts, publicly, you said that fire's been burnt out already. You should have nothing to fear. The truth will be made known, but if the truth is that we're saved, then that is a truth we want made known. God, I pray that you bless every single heart, every single person here, that we might be all reconciled with you. And at the end of the day, that we might all see you there forever in heaven in your presence. May your name be praised. Amen.